The photograph arrived at the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, D.C., in a cardboard box marked USS Eastland Disaster, Miscellaneous. I was working as an archivist intern that summer of 2019, cataloging materials related to one of America's forgotten maritime tragedies. And I'd spent weeks sorting through hundreds of images, documents, and artifacts. The USS Eastland disaster had occurred on July 24, 1915, in Chicago. The passenger ship, overcrowded with employees of the Western Electric Company heading to a company picnic, had rolled over while still tied to the dock in the Chicago River. 804 people died, making it the largest loss of life from a single shipwreck on the Great Lakes. I'd seen dozens of photographs from that day. Rescue workers pulling bodies from the overturned hull, crowds gathered on the riverbank, divers searching the murky water. The images were haunting but historically invaluable. This particular photograph had been donated by the estate of a retired Coast Guard officer, along with several other maritime disaster photographs from the early 20th century. The image showed what appeared to be a rescue operation, probably taken later on the day of the disaster or in the days following. A large group of men, maybe 30 or 40, stood in a line stretching across the frame. Most wore life preservers over their work clothes. Behind them, I could see parts of what looked like dock equipment, cranes, and industrial buildings. A few men stood atop what appeared to be the overturned hull of a ship. It was a powerful image of the rescue efforts, showing the scale of the operation and the number of men involved in trying to save lives and recover bodies. I catalogued it accordingly and began the process of scanning it at high resolution for the digital archive. That's when I noticed something wrong. I was examining the high-resolution scan, checking for any damage to the original photograph that might need noting in the records, when I saw him. Or rather, I saw where he should have been. In the center of the line of men, standing among the others in their life preservers, was a figure whose head simply wasn't there. His body was present, shoulders, torso, arms hanging at his sides, legs. He wore a life preserver like the others. But where his head should have been, there was nothing. Just the background, the industrial equipment and buildings visible behind the line of men. I blinked and looked again. It wasn't a flaw in the photograph, wasn't damage to the original print. The emulsion was intact in that area. The image was continuous. It was as though someone had carefully painted out this man's head, leaving his body, but erasing his face from existence. Except that wasn't right either. Under magnification, I could see that the background details visible where his head should have been, a crane arm, part of a building, showed the natural grain structure of the original photograph. This wasn't retouching or manipulation. This was how the image had been captured. One sailor, standing in line with his fellows, his body clearly visible, his head simply absent. I called over my supervisor, Dr. Patricia Holland, who'd been curating the NHHC's photograph collection for 20 years. She examined the image, first with her naked eye, then under magnification, then with various filters and lights we used to detect photographic manipulation. "It's not retouching," she said finally. "The grain is consistent throughout. Whatever we're seeing was present when the photograph was taken. Could it be a double exposure? Someone moving during the shot?" The exposure times were fast enough by 1915 that you wouldn't get this effect from movement, And look at the men on either side of him. They're perfectly sharp. If this were a movement blur, we'd see some indication in the surrounding area. But we don't. It's just this one figure. She pulled up the scan on her computer and began enhancing different sections. "Look here," she said, pointing. "You can see the life preserver clearly. You can see his arms, his torso. The detail is consistent with the rest of the photograph. But the head, it's as though it was never there, as though the camera photographed his body, but not his head." I felt a chill run through me. "That's impossible." "I know." She sat back, frowning at the screen. "But I've examined enough historical photographs to know what manipulation looks like. And this isn't it. Whatever we're seeing is authentic to the original image." Over the next week, Dr. Holland and I researched everything we could find about this photograph. The donation records indicated it had come from the estate of former Coast Guard Captain Thomas Brennan, who died in 2018 at the age of 97. Captain Brennan had been a collector of maritime disaster photographs and had apparently acquired this image sometime in the 1950s or 1960s. We contacted his family. His daughter, Susan Brennan Martinez, remembered the photograph. "Dad had that picture in a folder by itself," she told us over the phone. "He kept it separate from his other disaster photographs. I asked him about it once when I was a teenager, and he got this strange look on his face. He said, 'Some things in that picture shouldn't be there, and some things that should be there aren't.' I didn't understand what he meant, and he wouldn't explain further. Some things that should be there aren't, like a head." We found the photographer's mark on the original print, J. Westcott, Commercial Photography, Chicago. A little research revealed that James Westcott had been a prominent news photographer in Chicago in the early 1900s. He'd covered the Eastland disaster extensively, and several of his photographs had appeared in newspapers at the time. But this particular image had never been published. We checked every newspaper archive we could access, every book about the disaster. This photograph had never appeared in print. I found Westcott's estate papers at the Chicago History Museum. Among them was a journal he'd kept, documenting his work. The entry for July 26, 1915, caught my attention. "Returned to the river today to photograph the continuing rescue efforts. The scene remains chaotic. Divers still working to recover bodies from inside the hull, which remains overturned at the dock. I made several exposures showing the rescue workers lined up along the dock. When I developed the plates this evening, one image troubled me greatly. In one photograph, one of the rescue workers appears incomplete. I thought at first it was a flaw in the plate, but examination shows the plate is undamaged. The image simply captured him as less than whole. I remembered him from when I arranged the men for the photograph. He was young, perhaps 25, and seemed distracted or unwell. When I asked the men to line up for the shot, he took his place among them, but he kept looking over his shoulder toward the overturned ship, as though he heard something the others didn't. After I made the exposure, he walked away from the line and headed toward the hull. I didn't think much of it at the time. Men were coming and going constantly. But now I wonder if something was already wrong with him, if he was already diminished in some way that only the camera could see. Already diminished. I read that line several times, trying to understand what Westcott meant. Had the sailor been injured, ill, Why would that cause his head not to appear in the photograph? I kept reading. The next entry was dated July 28th. I've made inquiries about the young man from my photograph, the one whose image appears incomplete. I learned from one of the divers that a rescue worker named Thomas Keating, age 24, went missing on the day I took that photograph. He'd been part of the recovery crew, but vanished sometime in the afternoon. They assumed he'd gone home, overcome by the gruesome nature of the work. His body was recovered from inside the ship's hull yesterday. The coroner said he'd been dead for several days, meaning he must have died on the 26th, the same day I photographed him standing with the rescue crew. But that's impossible. I saw him that day. He was alive when I took his photograph. I'm certain of it, aren't I? I sat back from the computer screen, my heart pounding. Thomas Keating had died on July 26, 1915, the same day the photograph was taken. His body was found inside the overturned hull of the Eastland, even though he'd been part of the rescue crew, not one of the original victims. And in the photograph taken that day, he appeared with his fellow rescue workers, but without his head. I found Keating's death certificate in the Cook County records. Cause of death, drowning. The body had been discovered in one of the flooded compartments inside the ship's hull. The coroner's report noted severe head trauma, but attributed it to the victim being struck by debris inside the ship as it filled with water. Severe head trauma. A headless figure in a photograph. I found one more document, a brief mention in a Chicago Tribune article from July 29, 1915. Among the latest victims recovered from the Eastland is Thomas Keating, 24, who had been working as part of the rescue effort. Mr. Keating apparently entered the ship's hull in an attempt to reach trapped victims, but became trapped himself and drowned. His body was recovered yesterday from a flooded compartment. In a tragic irony, the rescuer became a victim of the very disaster he was trying to ameliorate. Fellow rescue workers reported that Mr. Keating had seemed not himself on the day of his death, that he kept insisting he could hear voices calling from inside the ship, even from areas that had already been thoroughly searched. Some suggested he had been overcome by the horror of the scene, that his mind had been affected by the work of pulling so many bodies from the water. Others said he simply wanted to ensure no one was overlooked, that he couldn't bear the thought of leaving someone trapped inside. Regardless of his reasons, Thomas Keating made the ultimate sacrifice, giving his life in an attempt to save others. I thought about James Westcott's journal entry, the young man who had seemed distracted or unwell when the photograph was taken, who had looked over his shoulder toward the overturned ship, as though he heard something the others didn't. Thomas Keating, hearing voices calling from inside the ship. Thomas Keating, walking away from the line of rescue workers after the photograph was taken. Thomas Keating, entering the hull and never coming out. And the photograph, capturing him in that moment of transition. Present, but already somehow gone. His body there, his head, the seat of consciousness, of life, already absent. Dr. Holland and I compiled a comprehensive report on the photograph, documenting everything we'd found. We consulted with photographic experts, forensic analysts, and historians. No one could explain how the image had been created. It's authentic, they all agreed. This is what the camera captured in 1915. We just don't know why. The photograph is now part of the permanent collection at the NHHC. displayed with documentation about Thomas Keating and the Eastland disaster. The placard reads, "Rescue workers at the USS Eastland disaster, Chicago River, July 26, 1915. Photograph by James Westcott." This image contains an unexplained anomaly. One figure appears without a head visible in the frame. The figure has been tentatively identified as Thomas Keating, a rescue worker who died later that day while attempting to recover victims from inside the ship's hull. Visitors often ask if the photograph has been altered, if this is some kind of hoax or digital manipulation. We show them the analysis, explain that we've authenticated the image as an original 1915 print, that there's no evidence of retouching or manipulation. Most people seem to accept it as an unexplained quirk of early photography, a technical anomaly, an accident of light and chemistry. But I can't stop thinking about James Westcott's journal, about how he said Keating seemed diminished in some way that only the camera could see. The camera saw something that day. It saw Thomas Keating standing with his fellow rescue workers, but it also saw that he was already gone, already being pulled toward the ship that would claim his life. It captured him in that liminal state, present but absent, alive but already dying, his body there but his consciousness, his self, already somewhere else, already inside the hull, answering voices that only he could hear. The head in the photograph is missing because Thomas Keating's head, his mind, his awareness, his attention, was no longer with his body. He stood in line with the other men, but he was already listening to the victims trapped inside the ship, already moving toward them, already becoming one of them. The camera, being a camera, could only capture what was physically present. And Thomas Keating's head, his consciousness, was no longer physically present in that moment. It had already left, pulled toward the ship by whatever voices he heard. Whatever need compelled him to enter that flooded hull and never emerge. So the photograph shows his body, standing dutifully with the rescue crew, wearing his life preserver, taking his place in the line. But where his head should be, there's nothing. Just the background, just the equipment and buildings behind the men. Because that's what was really there. Thomas Keating's body, going through the motions. But Thomas Keating himself, the thinking, aware, conscious part of him, was already gone. The photograph doesn't lie. It shows exactly what it captured. A rescue worker whose head was no longer present, even though his body stood with the others. A man in transition between life and death, between presence and absence, between the world of the living and the world of the drowned victims trapped inside the Eastland's hull. 3 hours after the photograph was taken, Thomas Keating would enter that hull for the last time. He would die in the flooded compartments, becoming another victim of a disaster he'd been trying to prevent. His body would be recovered 2 days later, showing severe head trauma, as though the injury to his physical head was the final manifestation of something that had already happened to him spiritually, mentally, hours before. The photograph captures that moment of transition, the moment when Thomas Keating was still technically alive, but already claimed by death, when his body still stood among the living, but his head, his self, was already with the dead. And the camera, that cold, mechanical eye, recorded the truth that human eyes couldn't see. The rescue worker whose head had already left him, pulled toward the voices calling from inside the overturned ship. I've examined that photograph hundreds of times now. I've traced the outline of his shoulders, his torso, his arms. I've studied the life preserver he wore, the position of his hands, the way he stood among his fellow workers. And I've looked at the empty space where his head should be, seeing the crane arm and building that are visible through that absence. Seeing the proof that Thomas Keating was already no longer whole when that photograph was taken, that something essential had already been taken from him, or had already been pulled away toward the ship that would claim his life. The photograph is haunting, not because it shows death. We have many photographs of death from the Eastland disaster. It's haunting because it shows the moment before death, the transition, the process of dying, captured in a single frozen instant. A man standing with other men, present but already gone, visible but already vanished, alive but already dead. The rescue worker whose head was no longer there, even though his body remained, going through the motions of life for a few more hours, before finally following his head into the dark, flooded compartments of the USS Eastland, where he would die, answering voices that only he could hear, where he would become another victim of the disaster, his name added to the list of 844 people who lost their lives on that terrible day in July 1915. But unlike the others, Thomas Keating left behind one final mystery, one photograph that shows the impossible. A rescue worker standing in line, a body without a head, a man already lost even as he stood among the living. The camera captured the truth that day, the truth that James Westcott suspected but couldn't quite articulate, the truth that Thomas Keating himself might not even have known. He was already gone, already being pulled toward the ship, already listening to voices that called him to dive into the hull one last time. The photograph shows a rescue operation. It shows men in life preservers, standing ready to help, to save lives, to prevent more deaths. And in the center of that line, it shows one man whose rescue would never come, who was already past saving, who stood with his fellow workers, but whose head, whose consciousness, whose self had already been claimed by the disaster he was trying to fight. One sailor, headless in a photograph. One man, dying in broad daylight, surrounded by others who couldn't see what was happening to him. One rescue worker who should become a victim, captured in that moment of transition by a camera that saw what human eyes could not. The photograph remains. Thomas Keating remains in it, frozen forever in that moment when he was present but absent, alive but dying, there but already elsewhere. A body standing in line, a head already somewhere else. A rescue worker who would never be rescued. A man listening to voices that led him to his death. And a photograph that captured the impossible truth, that sometimes death doesn't wait for the body to stop moving. Sometimes it claims the head first, pulling consciousness away while the body continues its routines for a few hours more. Sometimes the camera sees what we cannot see. And what it saw that day in July 1915 was a young man standing with his fellow rescue workers, his body present, his life preserver secure, his hands at his sides, but his head already gone, already somewhere else, already with the victims he could hear calling from inside the ship, already dead, even though he would continue walking and moving and living for 3 more hours. The photograph proves it, shows the truth in stark, undeniable clarity. One sailor, headless in a line of men. One truth captured by accident, by a camera that saw what it saw, and recorded it faithfully, even though what it saw should have been impossible, even though the truth it captured would trouble James Westcott for the rest of his life, even though, more than a century later, we still can't fully explain how a photograph can show a man's body standing in line while his head simply isn't there. We can only look at it, document it, and accept what it shows us. Thomas Keating, age 24, rescue worker at the USS Eastland disaster, present in the photograph but already absent, alive in that moment but already dying, his body with the living, his head already with the dead. The photograph doesn't lie. It shows exactly what was there on July 26, 1915. A rescue worker without a head, a man already claimed by the disaster, a body going through the motions while the consciousness that animated it had already gone somewhere else. The photograph captured that impossible truth, and we, looking at it more than a century later, can only bear witness to what the camera saw: a headless sailor standing in a line of rescue workers. The proof that death doesn't always wait for the body to fall. Sometimes it takes the head first. And sometimes a camera is there to record the evidence.